Dawn leaks into the valley like thin milk, draining the black from the ridges until stone shows its true color. Lot stands on the slope above Zoar with ash in his nostrils and the taste of brine on his tongue. Behind him the plain is a furnace, columns of smoke braided with orange, a strange weather made of judgment. The command that hustled him out of the city still rings in his ears. Do not look back. It is the kind of order that sounds simple until your whole life is behind you. Somewhere along the line below, where the road bends and the wind flattens the grass, his wife is no longer walking. She has become geography. The story the book tells begins the night before at the gate of Sodom, with two travelers who are not merely men. Lot rises to meet them because hospitality is the last good habit the city has not managed to ruin. He insists they come under his roof. He kneads dough, salts meat, and sets out flatbread that still breathes flour. They have barely tasted when the city remembers what it loves. A crowd gathers demanding that the strangers be handed over. The language of hospitality is twisted into a threat. The door becomes a courtroom. Lot pleads, bargains, and shows a moral fracture that makes modern readers wince, offering his daughters to appease the mob, as if purity could be spent like coin to purchase a smaller evil. It is an awful sentence preserved without euphemism, the ledger noting not only the city's crime, but the host's compromise. The guests are done with debate. They pull Lot inside, slam the door, and make the crowd blind, panic blind, wall groping, exhausted with rage. Then they turn to Lot and speak plainly. Gather everyone who will listen and leave. Sons-in-law laugh it off, the way people laugh at warnings that require them to move their furniture. Midnight climbs toward dawn, and the house thickens with indecision. At first light, the traveler sees wrists, Lot's, his wife's, his daughter's, and drag them toward the road. Mercy sometimes looks like rough hands. They run, clumsy with urgency. One of the angels gives the rules as if listing a prescription. Flee for your life. Do not look back. Do not stop anywhere in the plain. Escape to the hills. Lot, winded and afraid of the mountain's loneliness, negotiates for a small town nearby. Zoar, little and survivable. Permission is granted. The sun clears the ridge. The first red heat flows over the plain. Sulfur and fire fall like a second sky. Divine crime is where we read the scene like evidence. What, exactly, is the crime in this portion of the story? The city's guilt is gross and obvious. Violence rebranded as law, hospitality violated at the threshold, cruelty that calls itself entertainment, appetite that believes it is sovereign. The victims are the vulnerable and the visitor, the people a city is meant to protect. The accomplices are everyone who stands in the street and calls the door an insult. The witnesses include Lot, paralyzed by the calculus of lesser evils. The angels, who do not trade words for longer than truth can bear. And finally, a woman whose final act is a single turn of the head. She has no recorded name in the text, only a role. Lot's wife. Perhaps she had a mother's name on the mother's lips that morning, a neighbor's name someone would have called across a courtyard while drawing water. In our telling, she is not an abstract caution, but a person with a house that held her recipes, a courtyard date palm that shaded her daughter's childhood, a shelf where she kept figs for winter. When she runs, she drags more than a hem. She drags a city's worth of sense memories. Sodom is condemned, but it is still hers. The command not to look back is not simply about necks and eyes. It is about allegiance. Looking back is more than glancing over your shoulder. It is fastening your heart to a place God has named as ruin. The wives of men often bear the costs of the men's compromises. Here, she bears the cost of her own. Somewhere between Zor and the edge of the valley, she turns. Maybe she turns at the scream of a neighbor. Maybe she turns to see if the house collapsed the way she imagined. Maybe she turns because we are made to witness, and to leave without witnessing feels like betrayal of the life that was. The book does not tell us her thought. It only records the sentence. She became a pillar of salt. Salt is not chosen at random. The valley sits near the Dead Sea, a world made of mineral and mirage, where salt cliffs break in cubes as neat as carved altars. Salt preserves and kills. It seasons and sears. In covenant language, a covenant of salt suggests permanence. In curse language, salting a ruin forbids it to heal. To become salt is to be made a marker, a boundary post more eloquent than stone. The road below Zoar carries travelers who will point at the column and say, "There." That is where allegiance turned into arrest. Guilt, motive, method. This is the grammar of divine crime. But there is a tenderness we owe the defendants even when the verdict is clear. The city deserved its verdict. The woman disobeyed hers. Yet everything human in us recognizes the pull she felt. Leaving is not only a physical act, it is the breaking of a habit, a refusal to let loss define your gaze. In that light, the command, "Do not look back," is mercy, a surgical cut that keeps infection from reaching the heart. She could not accept the incision. Lot reaches Zoar with his daughters, and the shaking that comes after a sprint you wished you didn't have to run. He looks east and sees smoke like a kiln. The story will tell later of a cave, of choices that mix despair and survival into a brew that does its own kind of damage. But for a moment, the camera stays on the ridge with the column, where wind tastes like tears evaporated into mineral. We are meant to feel the weight of consequence without the pleasure of superiority. A city is not condemned because a neighbor forgot to bring soup. It is condemned because strangers became prey. It is condemned because justice became rumor while appetite became ordinance. The rescue of Lot is not a trophy. It is an indictment wrapped in mercy paper. The death of his wife is not a riddle. It is a signed warning that looking back with longing at what God has named ruin turns longing into a tomb. If this were merely an old thing preserved because the desert keeps stories like the desert keeps bones, we could nod and move on. But the human default toward the familiar is forever strong. We make our Sodoms in small ways, a workplace where cruelty is a sport, a home where hospitality is rationed to the deserving, a town where the visitor is always wrong. We also make our pillars, souvenirs of bad devotions we display proudly because calling them ruin would cost too much. The text offers no gentle version of repentance. It says, "Leave." It says, "Do not look back." It says, you cannot both mourn a city's ways as judgment falls and cling to those ways as if they fed you. Divine crime is not the court of our clever cynicism. It is the courtroom where memory calls us to the stand. It asks whether we will exit what burns when the door at last opens, whether we can walk without making a museum out of what poisoned us. It grants that running is frightening and that mountains are lonely. It does not apologize for commands that save. Some travelers, ancient and modern, have claimed to see a salt pillar that looks like a woman, weather-carved and pale against the blue. Maybe they did. The geology permits fables. The better monument is the line of text that has resisted smoothing by apologetics and sentiment. The line insists that obedience is not less human than grief, that a quickened pace can be holier than a lingering look, that faith sometimes arrives wearing hurry and holding your wrist. So the morning hardens. The plain smokes like a kiln. The little town receives 3 refugees who do not yet know how to live with what they have seen. Up on the road, salt stands like a bell that cannot ring yet somehow keeps time. Lot will learn that fleeing is not the same as arriving. His daughters will learn that making a future without trust is another kind of backward glance. We, who can leave the page without packing, are left with the simplest line in a hard chapter. Remember Lot's wife. Thank you for listening to Divine Crime. Subscribe for more true stories from the most dangerous book ever written.